Сайн байцгаана уу хүн үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр манай дефакто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын мянганы сорилтын сан корпорацийн хуулийн хэлтсийн Авлига санхүүгийн эсрэг байгууллагын Ахлах захирал ноён Кристофер П.Уильямс оролцож байна.
Кристофер П.Уильямс мянганы сорилтын корпорацийн авлиг хээл хахууль санхүүгийн луйвартай тэмцэх асуудал хариуцсан Ахлах захирал. Кристофер П.Уильямс нь мянганы сорилтын корпорацийн авлиг хээл хахууль санхүүгийн луйвартай тэмцэх багт 2011 оноос ажилласан бөгөөд програм менежмент болон техникийн дэмжлэг үзүүлэх чиглэлээр олон улс болон Америкийн нэгдсэн улсад суурин ажиллаж байна. Кристофер П.Уильямс нь 2007-оос 2010 онд Молдовын компактыг хариуцсан эдийн засгийн өсөлтөөр ядуурлыг бууруулах зорилготой 262 сая $2 компакт гэрэг боловсруулж амжилттай хэлэлцээр хийхэд Молдов улсын засгийн газар төрийн бас байгууллага зэрэг оролцогч талуудад дэмжлэг үзүүл ажилласан. Тэрээр бүү заалын Хамилтон зөвлөх фирмийн Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын олон улсын хөгжлийн агентлагийн санхүүжилттэй хууль эрх зүйн засаглалын хөтөлбөрийн менежерээр ажиллаж байсан. Кристофер П.Уильямс нь Haverfordын коллежийг Орос хэл уран зохиолын чиглэлээр дүүргэж, Жоржтауны их сургуульд Орос орон судлалын чиглэлээр магистрийн зэрэг хамгаалсан. Тэрээр Оросын холбооны улс болон Украинд олон улсын санхүүгийн корпорацийн газар зохион байгуулалтын өөрчлөлт шинжилгээний төслүүдэд үйл ажиллагааны менежерээр ажлын гараагаа эхэлж өчээ.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Please tell us what are you doing now in Mongolia at this moment?
Thank you very much. I am in Mongolia as a part of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is implementing a $350 million program to improve the water resources in Ulaanbaatar. I am here to provide 3 days of training to our counterpart organization, the Millennium Challenge Account Mongolia, on how to reduce the risks of fraud and corruption in the implementation of our program.
Well, before we go into details, just my understanding is MCC is organizing the second largest project in Mongolia in its history since 2004. And this one is about $350 million from US taxpayers' money and some $110 or so million from Mongolian side.
Correct.
And under this project, they will renew water resources supply of Ulaanbaatar down the road to Sanгийн direction. They will make a lot new wells, and they will clean that water, prepare for drinking, and creating some 30 plus or 40 years reserve of the Ulaanbaatar. At the same time, also under this project, they will renew or grey water from the central water sewage system. So it's a huge project which undoubtedly changed the way we live in Ulaanbaatar, our water supply. But however, with that, also new, because I was at your lecture, that will also bring a new interesting impact on the governance of the country. That's my opinion. And let's talk about that, your training sessions, and you said particular about the decrease of risk of corruption.
Yes.
There is a risk of corruption?
There's a risk of corruption everywhere. There's corruption in the United States. There's corruption in every country that we work in. And there is corruption in Mongolia. It's just, we have to all recognize that corruption can happen anywhere and at almost any time. So what we focus on doing is trying to reduce the risk of fraud and corruption so that we are aware of what the risks are, when they occur, and therefore how we can try to minimize those risks.
I do agree with the risk of corruption with particular money, government money, which is not the particular person's money, and plus because the sum of total together we talk about almost $500 million for 5 years. And by the way, this just as soon as it starts, it should be finished by the end of the 5 years, right?
Yes, sir.
Which is so much strong requirement. in particular in Mongolia, where we always delay projects. So hopefully it will be some on time.
Not just in Mongolia.
Let's go. Okay, what kind of corruptions is and what kind of risks? Because I understand you do it with MCC projects in how many countries?
I think I've done this training. This might be my 10th country in which we've done this training. We require this training in all countries with which we sign a grant agreement.
Okay.
So this is not targeting Mongolia. This is something that happens in every country. In fact, we are delivering the training in Mongolia at an earlier point than in any other country because of the strong interest by our counterpart organization, MCA Mongolia, and our representatives here in Mongolia wanted to make sure that all of our counterpart staff in MCA Mongolia are aware of the risks of fraud and corruption and can start working already to reduce those risks.
MCA Mongolia is a Mongolian entity,
Yes.
which is responsible for using both countries' fund for the project, and it involves so many foreign, because it's large sum, 2 large projects, it involves many foreign and Mongolian companies.
Yes,
And it is a lot procurement because
Yes.
it's not producing itself.
of course.
It is not making itself, right? So, let's talk about the way how you are warning the people. Where are the risks? How do we measure? By the way,
The way that we structure the training is we start by describing in detail what MCC's policy on reducing the risks of fraud and corruption are. We have an anti-fraud and corruption policy that is public. It's available on our website. And this policy, it prohibits any bribery, collusion, or other corrupt use of MCC funding. 2, it requires that all of our counterpart organizations, including MCA Mongolia, undertake the training that we're about to deliver so that they are aware of what the risks are. And 3, that all MCA Mongolia and MCC staff like me are required to report any concerns of potential fraud and corruption. So we make that an active obligation of MCA staff and MCC staff.
when you say required, that's kind of a part of your job.
Yes.
As soon as you see anything that possibly may be a corruption, it's your duty to report.
Yes.
What happens if not reported?
Well, if there is a failure to report potential fraud and corruption, and we find out that there was potential fraud and corruption, there is a possibility of an investigation whereby the investigators would be asking the individual, why didn't you report fraud and corruption that you either were aware of or really should have been aware of? And if there is a knowing failure to report fraud and corruption, then there are sanctions that can be applied to individuals.
What kind of sanctions?
Well, the MCA Mongolia staff, they work for MCA Mongolia and not MCC, so MCC would not be applying sanctions itself. But sanctions could be as severe as being suspended without pay for a certain amount of time, not being promoted if they were up for a promotion, as far as termination, because it is an obligation. We would look at, we MCC and MCA Mongolia leadership would look at the circumstances to make sure that whatever decision was fair, and why the individual did not report. One of the reasons why we do this training, and we also put up, we have the MCA put up posters in their office so that people are reminded how to report. One of the reasons why we do that is so that none of the staff can argue that they didn't know that they were supposed to report it. We want to make sure that that defense is removed.
Well, this is what we know in the U.S. This is the requirement, or I would say equality. This is the culture of whistleblowing.
Yes.
Right? And in the U.S., you have also strong protection of whistleblower. In this country where there's no protection law, how do you see the development?
Well, that's a very good question. The easiest answer is pertaining to MCA Mongolia staff. If an MCA Mongolia staff member reports a concern of potential fraud or corruption, as part of our anti-fraud and corruption policy and also the human resources policy of all of our MCAs, retaliation is forbidden. In fact, if somebody were to make a claim and report of potential fraud or corruption, and a individual in the MCA were to try to retaliate against them, that would be considered an act of fraud and corruption itself. That act of retaliation. I will be honest. We do have limited authority outside of MCA Mongolia, so we are very careful to protect the identity of people who make reports of fraud and corruption. There have been cases where an individual has, in other countries, where an individual has made a report of potential fraud and corruption, and we, in looking into the situation, determined that, say, only 3 people were aware of this fraud or corruption. In a situation like that, often we will consider not taking any action, because if we took any action, it would be obvious who had blown the whistle. And so we want to protect the identities of people and not make them vulnerable to pressure or retaliation.
Well, that might, down the road, bring the idea to Mongolian government to be in a hurry with this new law of whistleblowing protection. And I also understand, Chris, that from the first project, MCC in Mongolia, there were certain complaints. And those who, have you checked those complaints and what happened those who really, if somebody was doing wrong?
There were a number of complaints that came out during the first compact in Mongolia. Several of them were substantiated. We were confident that that there actually were acts that we would consider fraudulent or corrupt. Several individuals from the original MCA were terminated, were removed. There were a few procurements where there were risks of, or where we were confident that there was fraud or corruption involved in the procurement, where we either intervened in the procurement process, for instance, replacing the members of the panel that was reviewing all of the applications, or we, in a few cases, we just terminated the procurement and just did not do the procurement that was intended, because we were concerned that the procurement itself had been sufficiently corrupted that it could not be remediated.
Okay. Now, finally, let's go back to the content. Of course, it's cheaper to prevent corruption than after fighting, right? In that sense, that's one of the reasons probably of the training.
So after we discuss the anti-fraud and corruption policy and make it very clear to all of the MCA staff their responsibilities to report concerns of fraud or corruption, we go through a process of telling them where the risks of fraud and corruption are in each stage of a program. From the program design and beneficiary selection stage, which Mongolia has pretty much already passed, but we do discuss it because it is still useful information for them to know. We spend a lot of time discussing the risks of fraud and corruption around procurement. It's widely considered that procurement is the area where the biggest risks of fraud and corruption are. Out of all the allegations that we've received of potential fraud and corruption from across the world since 2009, approximately 38% of all those allegations have pertained to procurement. We also spend a good amount of time discussing the risks of fraud and corruption on contract administration or contract management. So once a contractor once a contract has been signed with a firm, there are still large opportunities for corruption in the contractor, well, not doing the work or doing the work not in accordance with the technical specifications. And then we have two smaller modules on the risks of fraud and corruption of the operations of MCA Mongolia itself, human resource policy, performance management, the purchases of office equipment and furniture. And then finally, we do have a unit, a small unit on the risks of fraud and corruption around the end of the compact program, which is still over 5 years away, but we do discuss what those risks are and what MCA Mongolia can do to reduce the risks at that stage already now in 2019. And then the last day, the last 4 hours of our training is around a process that we call the Anti-Fraud and Corruption Risk Assessment, where we discuss how MCA Mongolia and their MCC counterparts can identify the specific risks of fraud and corruption in the Mongolia program. We talk about each activity and identify where the risks are in each activity, as well as the general risks of fraud and corruption in procurement and contract management. So we have each MCA in every country talk in detail as to what the specific risks of fraud and corruption in that country, in that program will be.
Question is, when the contractor is doing certain jobs, I mean, based on independent auditing, you have to tell it's of that quality. So in which process you involve independent auditing, professionally, financially, etc.?
That's a great question, and that's one of the reasons why our programs use a lot of money. They're very expensive because we dedicate a lot of resources to ensuring that the work is actually being done. We start with the MCA Mongolia hiring through a competitive procurement process.
And by the way, it is not necessarily requiring American or Mongolian.
Thank you very much. There is no national preference.
So we can hire. I mean, this company can hire Chinese, French, Australian. Doesn't matter.
Well, we have some very limited restrictions. We don't allow construction by state-owned enterprises.
Okay.
And we also don't allow funding to be provided to firms that are based in countries that are considered by the United States or listed by the United States as state sponsors of terrorism, which I believe there are only 4 countries right now.
Which is under sanction of official sanction. So
Correct.
Otherwise,
otherwise, anybody from any country can pursue these.
That makes it even difficult, that monitoring.
Well, it's one benefit of it being open to all countries is that makes collusion harder, because if it's only open to, say, Mongolian companies, the Mongolian companies all know each other, and so they can collude with each other. If a French company or a Korean company or a Japanese company or an American company might be pursuing the opportunities, that makes collusion harder.
So you have independent auditing at each process.
Well, we have
quality
the MC
control. I mean,
well, even before we get to the contract being signed, we have MCA Mongolia has hired through an international competitive process, an international company that runs all of the procurement processes. So that is so MCA Mongolia isn't itself running the procurements. That provides some significant protections for MCA Mongolia. We require all procurements to be done in accordance with our program procurement guidelines, which are public and on our website, and about 160 pages, so very detailed stuff. Once the terms of reference, particularly for any significant contract, are reviewed by MCC professional staff or advisors working for MCC, not MCA Mongolia, to make sure the terms of reference are good, and also are not targeted towards a specific company, something that in anti-fraud corruption we call a technical overspecification. when selection panels review all of the proposals and rank them, the evaluation reports for any significant procurements are then also reviewed by MCC professional staff to see if they have complied with our procurement guidelines and also if they make technical sense. So there's all of that control even before the contract is signed. Once a contract is signed, there are still MCC staff who are responsible for overseeing the programs in Mongolia. And there are our standard operating procedure is that either MCC staff or, again, consultants working directly for MCC undertake regular visits to Mongolia, do site visits, and make sure that that there is some oversight from MCC. In addition to our currently 4-person office here in Ulaanbaatar. We do a lot of technical oversight to make sure the work is already being done. The primary responsibility, though, I do want to make sure is clear, rests with the government of Mongolia operating through MCA Mongolia. So MCA Mongolia itself will be having its staff visiting construction sites once construction starts. Our typical approach in any major engineering work is that we follow what are called FIDIC principles, in which MCA Mongolia will not only hire a company to do the work, they will hire an engineering company to oversee the company doing the work. And then MCA Mongolia itself will be overseeing the work of the overseer, and then MCC will be overseeing the work of MCA Mongolia, overseeing the work of the supervisor engineer. So there are multiple layers of oversight. Like I said, it is expensive, but in general we get very good results because it just turns out to be virtually impossible that you could have a situation that you see in some other countries like ghost roads or ghost hospitals where allegedly things are being built but they're not.
Yes, well, hopefully it is not the case, of course, after so many hard work preparations. Well, however, what happens, we found out a corruption, say $1 million damage, or how you would estimate the damage and what you will do.
Well, whenever there is an allegation of fraud and corruption, it comes to a team that I work with, that I lead as the Senior Director for Anti-Fraud and Corruption. We coordinate all allegations of fraud and corruption with our Office of Inspector General, which is actually housed in the United States Agency for International Development. Because MCC is a small organization, we don't have our own Inspector General. The Office of Inspector General has what they call the Office of Investigations, and they are the ones who actually carry out any investigations.
That Inspector General is in which office?
It's in USAID. It's
the USAID.
It's under the USAID.
Yeah, well, I mean, for the audience, MCC is created along with USAID, which is the main ODA arm of the U.S. government. But MCC is based on the really independent, but however have certain financial sources that can cooperate with the aid receiving country, giving more voice to this aid receiving countries rather than say you do it this, right?
Yes, country ownership is one of our most important values.
Just a little bit of aside of this. Sure. Inspector General, I understand, is in every government agency in the U.S.
Yes, in accordance with a law that was passed in the 1970s.
And that person, when?
In the 1970s.
1970s.
Yes.
And that person belongs to which other agency of the government?
The Inspector Generals are independent. Even the Inspector General for USAID, who serves as our Inspector General, is independent of the administrator of USAID. They report, I believe, to Congress.
To Congress.
They are independent. Nobody can tell.
The law from 70s? Just
from the 1970s. I don't remember which year. I want to say maybe 1977.
That's a very interesting function. I think the Mongolian government should have one, I think. They should have one independent guy. Otherwise, we don't know what's exactly happening in the departments. Okay, back to...
So if there is a allegation of fraud and corruption, If there is an allegation of fraud and corruption, we share it with our Inspector General. They can conduct investigations. If we believe that there was fraud or corruption, MCC has the right to demand the money back from the partner government. If we believe the money has been misused and we consider loss of money through fraud and corruption to be misuse, then MCC can issue a demand letter and require the government to pay us the money back. We don't like to do it, we don't really want to do it, and that's why we spend so much effort trying to prevent fraud and corruption in the first place, so that we don't have to do this.
But not only the government, also you should have some responsibility for that, no?
That's why we do the training, and that's also why we provide so much oversight throughout the entire compact program, is to reduce the window for the of opportunities for fraud and corruption. But the responsibility for preventing fraud and corruption rests with the government of Mongolia. It's written into our compact agreement.
Okay.
Yes.
Almost final questions. So let's say everything goes within 5 years as planned. 2 factory works, I mean the wells working, cleaning, and the other sewage water working after 5 years. Is it as soon as they start to work, the project finished? Or a very certain period that whether all things go well and in some kind of preliminary period for after everything is completed, start to work? How long MCA will be watching that project, or it's just leave it?
Well, MCC's ability to fund activities ends 5 years after the agreement enters into force, which is a legal process that we go through. We are forbidden by our legislation to spend any MCC funding after the 5 years. Now, if we think that there is, which has happened in a number of countries, if we think that there is work that needs to continue after the 5-year period is over, we will be in negotiations with the government well in advance of that period to make sure that the government takes on the responsibilities for those additional costs. In addition, as you mentioned, there is going to one of the activities in the project is focused on sustainability, on building capacity inside Mongolian government agencies.
Yes.
So that'll be very useful. And I do believe that part of the $112 million that is part of the Mongolian government's contribution, if necessary, could be used to support some activities going forward.
So they will train the people who will operate all the systems?
Yes, the people at USUG and other agencies, and there is I believe it's about $20 million set aside just for building capacity with and collecting information and training Mongolian counterparts on how to analyze information that's collected. Because we do want to make sure that the investments that are made are sustainable and that they don't become, the term we use is white elephant, that it's a beautiful building and set of machinery that starts falling apart almost immediately.
That's my concern. Very final question.
Oh, and I do want to say there is an obligation by the government of Mongolia to coordinate with MCC on monitoring evaluation of the program for at least 5 or 7 years after the end of the compact. So MCC will have staff that are monitoring what's going on in Mongolia for a number of years afterwards, and MCC will have, because we want to hold ourselves accountable, we will have independent companies, not MCC staff, but independent companies conducting evaluations, what we call performance and impact evaluations of the work for years after the compact is over.
You have been working with MCC for quite some time.
Yes, I joined in March 2007, and I was the team leader for developing the compact agreement with the Republic of Moldova.
Before, prior that, you speak Russian. You have been working with the Russian on several other projects.
Yeah, I majored in Russian language and literature in a university, and I studied in Moscow in 1988 and 1991, the years of Glasnost and Perestroika. And I worked and lived in Nizhny Novgorod, formerly Gorky,
Yes.
and Moscow from 1994 to 1999.
So you have been spent a lot of time with post-communist countries, right? Soviet Union, Russia, Moldova, now kind of Mongolia starting. What was the most difficult thing working with the different mentality, say former communist mentality, no private ownership? What was the most difficult one feature that you would think?
Well, when I'll be honest, when I was working with Moldova, the team that I led working with Moldova, only one other person on the team spoke Russian. So almost everybody had worked in Africa, in Asia, or in Latin America, but almost nobody had worked in the former Soviet Union. And so what I would tell my staff was one thing that they had to keep in mind from my interpretation of the Soviet and post-Soviet mindset was that there was a strong transactional approach, that there had to be give and take on everything, and two, that there was no real belief in an everybody wins situation. It was always you win, somebody's winning, somebody's losing, and
win-win.
Well, if somebody says it's a win-win situation, they're trying to cheat you, and you have to figure out how they're trying to cheat you, and that they had to understand that in interacting with their Moldovan counterparts and try to get over that. I was asked numerous times working in Russia, what do you get out of this?
Okay, so hopefully it is not the case here in Mongolia.
No.
Chris, wonderful conversation, very enlightening, informing. I especially invite you because for me, this AFC is not only the issue of Millennium Challenge corporations. I want these cultures be all around by all mining companies, by Mongolian government, so that's why. Great work.
Well, I appreciate you having me. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
За хүн түлхэгчтэй өнөөдөр манай дефакто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор энэ Америк нэгдсэн улсын Millennium Challenge Corporation гэдэг мянганы сорилын сан Монголд томоохон төсөл эхэлж байгаа. Тэрэн дээр одоо энэ авлигын эсрэг санхүүгийн энэ буруу явдлын эсрэг одоо тэмцэж байгаа энэ байгууллагын хүн Кристофер П.Уильямс оролцож та бүхэнд энэ төслийн тухай ярьлаа. Их баярлалаа.